Look at a photograph of HMS Rodney, and something feels off before you even know why. 9 enormous guns, 3 triple turrets, all of them crowded onto the front third of the ship. Behind that, nothing. A flat, empty deck stretching back to a single, stumpy funnel, as if someone had built a battleship and then forgotten to finish it. Naval architects don't design ships like this by accident. They design them like this when they're out of options. And in the case of HMS Rodney, the men who drew her up in 1922 were about as boxed in as battleship designers have ever been. What came out of that box would spend 19 years being mocked by her own Navy, and then, on one gray morning in the North Atlantic, she would use that same ugly design to help finish off the most feared warship in the world. This is the story of a battleship built by committee, hated by her own sailors, and vindicated in 8 minutes of point-blank gunfire. A warship built by treaty. To understand why Rodney looks the way she does, you have to start not in a shipyard, but in a conference room in Washington, D.C. in 1922. The First World War had just bankrupted half the world's navies, and nobody, not Britain, not the United States, not Japan, could afford to keep building bigger battleships forever. So the great powers sat down and agreed to stop trying. The Washington Naval Treaty capped the size of new battleships at 35,000 tons and limited their guns to 16 inches. For Britain's naval architects, this was a nightmare. Every design on their drawing boards, genuinely massive ships with heavier guns and thicker belts of armor, had to be thrown out overnight. What they were allowed to build instead became 2 ships, Nelson and Rodney. The engineers had a simple, brutal problem. They wanted the heaviest guns the treaty allowed. They wanted armor that could survive a modern shell. They wanted enough range and crew space to make the ship worth building at all. And they had exactly 35,000 tons to fit it into. Something had to give, so they cut the one thing that cost weight without adding punch. Length devoted to guns spread out across the hull. Instead of the traditional layout, guns fore and aft balanced, they crammed all 3 main turrets forward of the bridge. It shortened the section of the ship that needed the heaviest armor. It was, on paper, an elegant piece of engineering economy. In the water, it looked like a mistake. All the ship's teeth were bunched at one end. Everything behind the bridge was just empty deck and a lone smokestack sitting almost at the stern. Fleet sailors, who never miss an opportunity to name something they don't like, took one look and started calling Rodney and her sister the Ugly Sisters. Because the low silhouette and that single fat funnel made her look less like a battleship and more like an oil tanker, they nicknamed her class after Rodel, the Navy's fuel carriers. Nobody in the fleet in 1927 thought they were looking at anything special. What nobody bothered to calculate was this. Those 3 cramped, ugly turrets held 9 16-inch guns, the heaviest any battleship in the world was permitted to carry under the treaty. Add up the weight of steel a single Rodney broadside could deliver, and it came out roughly a third heavier than what Germany's newest battleship could deliver with her 8 lighter 15-inch guns. The ship the fleet laughed at carried, gun for gun, the hardest punch afloat. A tired ship on a quiet errand. Fast forward to May 1941. Rodney is 14 years old now, and the war has worn her down fast. Her boilers are tired, her hull leaks, and her top speed on a good day barely scrapes past 22 knots, slow enough that in a fleet of new German, American, and Japanese battleships built for 30, she's the slowest capital ship anyone still takes seriously. She'd earned a rest, and on paper she was finally getting one. On May 22nd, Rodney sailed from the Clyde, bound for the Boston Navy Yard for a full refit. New machinery, fresh guns, everything her aging hull needed. Officially, the United States was neutral. Unofficially, American shipyards were quietly patching up British warships. One more piece of a war America hadn't joined yet, but was already quietly fighting. She wasn't traveling light either. She was escorting the liner Britannic, and her own decks were stacked with the evidence of a ship halfway through being taken apart. Crates of spare boiler tubes, new gun mountings still packed in grease, dockyard workers riding along for the crossing. Down in her strong rooms sat a shipment of Bank of England gold, bound for North America. This was not a battleship prepared for a fight. This was a battleship on her way to the repair shop. 2 days out, on the evening of May 24th, that changed. The news from the Denmark Strait. Somewhere in the ice-cold water between Iceland and Greenland, the pride of the Royal Navy had just been destroyed. HMS Hood, the largest warship in the world for most of the interwar years, the ship every British schoolchild could recognize by silhouette alone, met Germany's newest battleship, Bismarck, that morning. The engagement lasted about 8 minutes. A shell struck near Hood's main mast. There was an explosion, and 48,000 tons of British steel broke in two and went down in roughly 3 minutes. Of a crew of over 1,400 men, 3 survived. Britain wanted blood, and every warship the home fleet could scrape together was ordered into the hunt. Rodney's captain, Frederick Dalrymple Hamilton, got the signal mid-crossing. He didn't wait for it to be confirmed twice. He turned her half-disassembled cargo-laden battleship away from her liner and pointed her east, toward a fight nobody had built her for and nobody expected her to reach in time. The chase. Here's the math that mattered. Bismarck, even damaged, could still outrun almost anything Britain had. Her design speed topped 30 knots. Rodney couldn't hit 22. Every hour Bismarck stayed healthy and ran flat out, she pulled another 9 miles ahead. If nothing slowed her down, Rodney would arrive at an empty patch of ocean, days too late. So Dalrymple Hamilton pushed his tired ship harder than she'd been pushed in years. In her boiler rooms, temperatures reportedly climbed past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Heat that would shut down a modern factory in minutes, and Rodney's stokers stood in it for hours at a stretch, wrapping wet rags around their heads and rotating through in shifts because nobody could survive a full watch in that heat. Up on deck, sailors spent the crossing throwing their own refit overboard, spare parts, boiler tubes, anything loose enough for an Atlantic gale to turn into a hazard. The gold stayed. Everything else that could go went. For 31 hours, Bismarck vanished entirely. No radar contact, no sighting, nothing. In an age before satellites, the Atlantic was still big enough to swallow a battleship whole. She was only found again because her own admiral, wrongly convinced he was still being tracked, sent a long radio message back to Germany. British direction-finding stations caught the transmission and worked out a rough bearing. Then, on the morning of the 26th, a Catalina flying boat spotted her through a break in the clouds and put her back on the map for good. But finding her wasn't the same as catching her. Nothing fast enough to close the gap was anywhere near, except one thing. A handful of ferry swordfish biplanes, fabric-covered relics with open cockpits and a top speed of about 90 knots, flying off the carrier Ark Royal into a full Atlantic gale. In that attack, in chaos and heavy anti-aircraft fire, one torpedo ran true and struck Bismarck near her stern, jamming her rudders in a hard turn. The fastest battleship in the world could suddenly only steer a slow, useless circle, and a circle pointed her straight back toward the ships hunting her.
point-blank range. At 8:47 in the morning of May 27th, with the sea heavy and the sky the color of wet iron, Rodney and King George V closed in on a battleship that could no longer run. Dalrymple Hamilton gave the order to open fire, and Rodney's 9 16-inch guns fired together for the first time in the battle. A concussion so violent it blew in windows on her own bridge and shattered crockery in her mess decks. Bismarck fired back, and for the first 20 minutes she fired well. Her gunnery officers were among the best trained in any navy, and her second salvo straddled Rodney. Then a heavy shell struck her forward command position, and in a single instant the men directing her battle from the bridge were gone. What happened next has no real precedent in battleship warfare. Dalrymple Hamilton did something battleship captains almost never do. He closed the range. Not to the usual 20,000 or 15,000 yards of a modern gunnery duel. Rodney's rangefinders at one point were reading roughly 2,700 yards, under a mile and a half. At that range, her guns were firing almost flat, hurling 1-ton shells across the water on something close to a straight line. Almost every shot landed. It remains, to this day, one of the closest gunnery duels ever fought between capital ships, and one that will likely never happen again, given how naval warfare has changed since.
The irony is that Rodney did more damage to herself than Bismarck managed to do to her. Firing her forward guns at such extreme angles and such close range, the muzzle blast of her own broadsides cracked deck plating, shattered fittings, and ruptured pipes throughout her own superstructure. The ship the Admiralty had dismissed as a slow, ugly compromise was tearing apart Germany's newest battleship, and the only real damage she suffered that morning came from the recoil of her own guns. By 9:30, Bismarck's main battery had gone silent for good. She would not sink easily, though. Her compartmentalization had been built for exactly this kind of punishment, and she stayed afloat, burning, absorbing shell after shell, until Admiral Tovey, watching his own fuel gauges run dry, finally gave the order to cease fire and turn for home, leaving the cruiser Dorsetshire to finish her with torpedoes. Bismarck rolled over and sank just before 10:40 that morning. Of a crew of over 2,000, 114 survived. No ceremony. Rodney's war didn't end there. She went on to serve through the Mediterranean and fired her guns again in support of troops landing at Normandy 3 years later. But the years of hard use finally caught up with her. By 1948, 3 years after the war ended, she was worn down past the point of repair and towed to the breakers at Inverkeithing, Scotland, to be cut apart for scrap. There was no ceremony. The ship that helped avenge Hood ended her career sold by weight, dismantled by men with cutting torches. It's worth sitting with that contrast for a second. Hood, sleek, famous, the ship every schoolchild in Britain could draw from memory, is remembered as a tragedy and a legend. Rodney, squat, awkward, mocked for 2 decades by her own fleet, did the actual work of finishing the job, and got a scrapyard for her trouble. Naval history is full of ships like this, the ones nobody wanted, built by committee and constrained by treaty, that end up doing the thing the beautiful ships couldn't. Rodney was never fast. She was never elegant. She was built backwards, by an accounting exercise disguised as a warship design. And on one morning in 1941, that backwards design put more steel into an enemy battleship at point-blank range than any ship in her navy ever had before or has since.